There are some people who grow up learning how to speak, and there are others who grow up learning how to stay silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that settles into the chest early and quietly teaches you that your thoughts are inconvenient, your emotions are too much, and your voice is something that should be carefully managed. This silence doesn't always come from obvious neglect or cruelty. Sometimes it comes from being the child who learned that speaking up led to tension, disappointment, or withdrawal. So instead you watched, you listened, you adapted, and without realizing it, that silence began shaping the way your mind works long after childhood ended. As a child, silence often feels safer than expression. When no one asks what you feel, you learn not to feel too loudly. When your questions are ignored or brushed aside, curiosity slowly turns inward. When emotions are met with discomfort or dismissal, the mind learns to hide them before they even reach the surface. Over time, this becomes automatic. You stop noticing the moment you swallow words. You stop realizing how often you pause before speaking. Silence becomes less of a choice and more of a default setting, one that follows you into adulthood disguised as calmness, maturity, or independence. But that silence doesn't disappear. It settles deep into your nervous system, shaping how you think, how you process emotions, and how you relate to others. You may notice that you overthink everything before you say it, replay conversations in your head, or feel exhausted after social interactions even when nothing went wrong. Your mind is constantly scanning, predicting, adjusting, trying to make sure that nothing you express creates discomfort, conflict, or rejection. This hyper-awareness is not random. It is the echo of a childhood where being quiet felt like protection. Many people who grew up in silence struggle to identify their own needs. When no one consistently asked what you wanted or how you felt, you learned to focus outward instead. You became skilled at reading moods, sensing shifts in tone, and anticipating reactions. This can look like emotional intelligence, but inside it often feels like confusion. You know what others need before they say it, yet when someone asks what you want, your mind goes blank. The silence trained you to prioritize harmony over honesty, safety over self-expression. This conditioning affects how your mind handles emotions. Instead of moving through them, emotions get analyzed, questioned, and often suppressed. You don't simply feel sadness, you wonder whether you're allowed to feel it. You don't just feel anger, you debate whether it's justified. Your inner world becomes a courtroom rather than a place of experience. This is why emotional numbness is so common among those who grew up quiet. When emotions were never welcomed, the mind learned to turn the volume down on all of them, not just the painful ones. Childhood silence also shapes the way you think about connection. You may crave closeness but feel uncomfortable when it arrives. Deep conversations might feel risky, even when you want them. You might keep people at a distance without fully understanding why. This isn't because you don't care, it's because your nervous system associates closeness with exposure, and exposure once felt unsafe. Silence taught you that staying unseen was a form of survival. Over time, this creates an internal split. On the outside, you may appear composed, thoughtful, even emotionally stable. On the inside, your mind is busy holding back words, feelings, and reactions. You replay things you didn't say, imagine conversations that never happened, and carry emotional weight that was never given space to move. The mind becomes crowded not because you think too much, but because too much was never expressed. One of the most subtle effects of childhood silence is how it shapes self-worth. When your voice wasn't consistently acknowledged, you may have learned to measure your value through usefulness rather than presence. You become the listener, the helper, the one who understands. You feel needed but not always known. And over time, your mind begins to believe that being low maintenance is the same as being lovable. This belief quietly influences your choices, your relationships, and the way you treat yourself. Silence also affects how you deal with conflict. Instead of addressing issues directly, your mind looks for ways to minimize, rationalize, or endure. You tell yourself it's not worth bringing up, that you're overreacting, that things will resolve on their own. But unresolved feelings don't disappear. They turn inward, becoming self-doubt, anxiety, or a constant sense of emotional fatigue. The mind stays busy carrying what was never allowed to be spoken. As an adult, you might wonder why your thoughts feel so loud even though you speak so little, why your mind never seems to rest, why simple decisions feel heavy, why expressing yourself feels harder than it should. The answer often lies not in your present circumstances, but in the patterns your mind learned early on. Silence trained your mind to hold, contain, and manage everything internally. It was efficient then. It is exhausting now. What makes this especially confusing is that childhood silence often comes without clear memories of harm. You might think, nothing bad really happened, or others had it worse. But silence doesn't need dramatic events to leave an imprint. It only needs consistency, consistently not being heard, consistently being the one who adapts, consistently learning that quietness keeps things stable. The mind remembers patterns more than moments. As you move through adulthood, this silent conditioning can show up as hesitation, emotional distance, or a sense that something is always slightly off. You may feel disconnected from yourself, unsure of what you truly feel, or afraid that expressing too much will push people away. Your mind remains alert, cautious, always managing the space between what you feel and what you allow to be seen. Understanding this is not about blaming the past. It's about recognizing how deeply early environments shape the way the mind operates. The silence that once protected you may now be limiting you, but awareness is the first shift. When you begin to see how childhood silence still controls your thoughts, reactions, and emotional habits, you also begin to loosen its grip. And that is where change quietly begins, not by forcing yourself to speak louder but by finally listening to the parts of you that learn to stay quiet. As you grow older, the silence you learned in childhood doesn't stay limited to your thoughts. It slowly begins to shape your relationships. You may notice that you struggle to explain what you feel, even to people who genuinely care about you. Words feel heavy. Emotions feel complicated. You might fear that if you speak honestly, you'll be misunderstood, judged, or emotionally abandoned. So instead, you offer pieces of yourself that feel safe, while the deeper parts remain unspoken. This creates connections that exist but never fully satisfy. In relationships, childhood silence often turns into emotional self-containment. You become the one who listens, who understands, who adjusts. You sense when something is wrong but you hesitate to name it. You wait for others to notice your discomfort instead of expressing it directly. And when they don't, your mind quietly interprets that as confirmation of an old belief, that your inner world isn't important enough to interrupt the flow of things. This pattern can lead to emotional loneliness even when you're not physically alone. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen, not because others don't care but because you never learned how to let yourself be fully known. Silence taught you how to survive, not how to connect, so closeness may feel unfamiliar, even overwhelming. When someone asks you to open up, your mind searches for the right thing to say instead of the true thing. Overthinking is another place where childhood silence leaves a deep mark. When you weren't allowed to express thoughts freely, your mind learned to process everything internally. Conversations don't end when they're over, they replay. Decisions don't settle, they loop. Your mind tries to find the safest possible version of every response, every reaction. This constant mental activity isn't a flaw, it's a learned strategy. But over time it becomes exhausting. The mind never rests because it was never taught that expression could be safe. Emotional numbness often follows. When feelings were inconvenient or ignored in childhood, the mind learned to dull them, not selectively but completely. You may struggle to feel excitement, deep joy, or even sadness. Everything feels muted, distant, like life is happening behind glass. This numbness isn't emptiness, it's protection. A system designed to keep you from feeling too much when feeling too much once felt dangerous. What makes this especially confusing is that silence can look like strength. You may be praised for being calm, mature, or independent. Others may see you as emotionally stable, while inside you feel disconnected from yourself. This disconnect creates a quiet grief, the sense that you're living life from the outside, observing rather than experiencing. Your mind knows how to function, but your heart feels far away. Healing doesn't mean forcing yourself to talk more or suddenly become expressive. The mind doesn't trust abrupt change. Healing begins with permission. Permission to notice what you feel without immediately judging it. Permission to sit with emotions without explaining them away. Permission to admit, even privately, that silence once kept you safe, but now it may be keeping you stuck. Retraining the mind starts in small moments. Noticing when you pause before speaking. Becoming aware of how often you minimize your own feelings. Gently asking yourself what you would say if you weren't afraid of disrupting the peace. These moments matter because they teach the nervous system something new, that expression doesn't automatically lead to loss. Learning to speak after a lifetime of silence is not about volume, it's about honesty. It's about letting your inner experience exist without immediately editing it. It's about allowing discomfort to pass instead of swallowing it. Each time you express something small, the mind learns that safety doesn't only come from hiding, it can also come from being real. You may find that as the silence loosens, emotions surface that you didn't realize you were holding. Sadness for the child who learned to stay quiet, anger for the needs that went unmet, fear of being too much. This is not regression. This is release. The The mind cannot heal what it was never allowed to feel. Over time, something shifts. Thoughts feel less crowded. Emotions move more freely. Connection feels less threatening. You begin to trust your voice, not because it's perfect, but because it's yours. The silence that once controlled your mind starts to soften, making room for clarity, presence, and self-understanding. Childhood silence does not define your future. It explains your patterns, but it does not limit your potential. The same mind that learned to adapt can learn to open. And slowly, gently, you begin to realize that your voice was never the problem. It was simply waiting for a place where it could finally be heard.